Well, thank you all for coming tonight. This is so exciting. My name is Irene Vázquez. I'm a publicist. I live in Quito. I've had the tremendous pleasure of working on What the Jaguar Told Her by Alexandra V. Méndez. I feel like everyone here probably knows you and all of your many accomplishments, but I will read the official bio just for the those who have yet to witness your brilliance. Alexandra V. Méndez is a writer, teacher, and scholar who grew up bilingual in Decatur, Georgia, with family roots in Mexico and Mississippi. She graduated from Harvard University in History and Literature and has a PhD in Latin American and Iberian cultures at Columbia University. What the Jaguar Told Her is her debut novel. Let's give her a round. Novels are so long. They're so hard to write. I'm so impressed with anybody that manages to actually write one. Alex, do you want to kick us off with the excerpt from the book?
Yes, thank you, Irene. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Word Up, for hosting this. I'm going to start off with an excerpt, and so I'll set it up a little bit. The main character, whose name is Jade, is walking home from school on a path that's woodsy and with little flowers, and she's kind of lost in her thoughts. And she recently moved to Atlanta from Chicago, so the place is new. Since it was Thursday and Katerina had daisies, Jade had headed into the forest on her own that afternoon. She liked it this way. She relished the quiet nature sounds, the bird chirps and leaf rustles that were so calming, and so different from the idling car engines and squealing laughter of the parking lot. As she stepped along the soft dirt path, the soles of her shoes stamping their rubber pattern into the ground, that feeling came over her again. The sense that someone was there, a familiar, invisible presence moving just beyond the leaves that flanked the path. It was as if someone she knew were beckoning to her, but she couldn't quite see them, much as she peered into the brush. Perhaps it was the forest itself that she was sensing. She continued down the path, letting herself be cradled by the comforting sensation as she wound through the trees. She let her mind wander with her steps. She thought of her reflection in the giant mirror in her parents' bathroom, and how the mirror couldn't tell her what she wanted to know. It couldn't tell her if she was pretty or what other people thought of her. It couldn't tell her if she would ever be a real OLH girl who wore the uniform just so and knew how to say the whole Hail Mary. There was, of course, the other mirror, the small black one that her mom had told her to keep. The reflection in that mirror wasn't clear. You couldn't use it very well to brush your hair or check your teeth. But what if the mirror could showed you something else? Not the flat reflection of how the light bounced off your face, but something different, something beyond that. Was it possible that the shiny black stone in her dresser drawer could show her something that an ordinary mirror could not? There was truly someone in the woods, off the path. Jade had no doubt about it this time. It wasn't a sound that let her know this, just a feeling, a certainty. She turned to look at the brush beside her, where she felt the presence, and behind green leaves shining in the late August sun that filtered through the trees, she saw a golden spotted hide. She froze. Jade held her breath. The pelt of a large animal moved noiselessly through the undergrowth. A powerful paw stepped out onto the path right in front of her, followed by the whole animal, a wild cat that rose to the height of her waist, solid and warm and filled with a palpable, terrifying energy. Its hide, taut across well-defined muscles, was dotted with the unmistakable black, eye-like rosettes of a jaguar. It was looking directly at her, with its solemn, amber-green eyes. Jade was too frightened to scream. She could not think. She could only stare at the muscled jaw and the piercing eyes. And then she realized that it was not a jaguar standing before her at all. Not a jaguar at all, but an old man.
I have so many questions that I want to ask you, but I guess I will start with how you got the idea for this book. So I know you have this, your degrees are in history and Latin American studies, but I just want to know how you kind of fused that into this gorgeous book.
It's a great question, and I'll answer it in, as succinctly as possible. In 2011, when I was in college, I had the idea for the book, and actually the Wildcat Trail, which is in the book where she's walking, this place exists, and it's called the Wildcat Trail, and it's in my neighborhood where I grew up in Decatur, Georgia. And so I was, part of it was thinking, I wanted to evoke some of the magic that I experienced as a child in these woods. And that was also the summer that I was interning at a museum, Dunbar Noakes, in Washington, D.C., and really getting into pre-Columbian studies and, Mesoamerican, ideas. And so that's how the Jaguar came about, more or less.
That's so cool. So one of the things that you draw from in Mesoamerican culture that's a really important figure in the book is the figure of the Abuela. Could you tell us a little bit about that and how that kind of forms the story and your interest in that figure?
Yes. And, over the course of the story, Jade kind of also finds out more. So she has these encounters with Itzli, the old man storyteller who's also a jaguar. And eventually she learns also like Latina, it takes her a while. This, and one of the main things that's interesting to me about ways of understanding the world and even language is how the written and what's writing and what's art, we think of these as separate things from our, largely Western context. But that's not necessarily the case in these contexts, and so the Abuela is both a writer and a painter. So that's kind of something that I wanted to play with and that I wanted Jade to also play with.
Yeah.
In the story.
No, she learns so much from Itzli, both about in the kind of philosophical sense about coming into her own, and it's such a powerful kind of coming of age story in that way of a 14-year-old who's in this new environment, who's starting these, uncovering these big feelings of what it's like to be 14. But then also coming into her own as an artist, which I think is so kind of powerful. It's part of a long history of kind of stories of artists coming into their own. Jade's an artist. Yeah, and so I was wondering what role art played in your life when you were a kid.
Yeah, thank you for asking this question. It's really interesting. I hadn't necessarily thought about this specifically when I was writing it, but as a kid, definitely, and I credit my parents with encouraging this as well. Art making was a huge part of what I grew up with, and also, just was in my family. Cooking is definitely an important art form that that I learned from a young age. But also, I did a lot of watercolors and origami and kind of a lot of things. I did play camp this summer, which was super fun. So I have a lot of ceramics and things like that. So that probably informed kind of a little bit of who Jade is in relation to art making and not just storytelling as well.
Yeah. No, that's so cool. So one of the things that Jade is also kind of working through in the book is her relationship with her Abuela, who she's left behind in Chicago, and this distance that she feels from her now. This distance in some ways from her Mexican-American heritage because she is mixed race. People don't necessarily always think that she's Mexican. And, her relationship with her heritage and her culture. So my particular question for you is, what is your relationship with Spanish like? Was that relationship with you growing up?
Yeah, thank you for this question. Definitely a big part of Jade's experience and a big part of the story has to do with having a white American background and Mexican American background, and it's about connecting with her heritage, even when, especially at first, there's this distance because she just moved away from some of her family. So, to answer specifically the question about language, I'm going to have to credit my parents absolutely for, you guys wanted me to be able to speak with my abuelos and have a relationship with them, and you did that, and I'm grateful for that. And, and I realize now as an adult the kind of work that was. And also, when I was 7, I lived for 6 months in Spain, and you have to speak in Spanish to get along with the other children, or to interact at all. So, at first I would understand everything and respond in English when I was a kid, and when I had to go to school with other kids who were asking me questions, I needed to respond to them in Spanish. So, growing up, Spanish has been, a huge part of my life. And I've actively cultivated that as an adult. And for Jade specifically, I think that was informed. Jade understands Spanish but doesn't speak it much, pretty much. And that's largely informed by also my experience with many of my students as well. Some of them were here. And sometimes it's really beautiful meeting students who grew up, listening to Spanish at home, but are now, as adults, looking for ways to reconnect with their heritage and their family members through the language. So all of that was kind of informing Jade's relationship to the Spanish language too.
Yeah, no, it's very evident in the book. This book is it's lyrical. It's like you have you can tell that you're somebody who really loves language, both in English and Spanish. A kind of related question. So the Spanish edition of the book is going to be coming out next year, and you've played a large role in helping shape that translation. What has that experience been like for you?
Oh, it's so exciting. First of all, just when I first heard it was going to be translated, that was like kind of a dream come true. And it's been really interesting. Speaking with Ariadna Molinari, who's the translator, thinking about what are the kinds of things that are important in a translation for it to be Mexican Spanish, for example, but also for it to be someone who really gets the book and the feel of it, I guess, more than just the meaning, of the words. And so I'm really happy that Ariadna is translating it because it's somebody who I trust to, render the language in a way that, she has freedoms to perhaps not be translating, literally, but actually getting the meaning across more holistically, more accurately.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
A lot of English, she's so cool.
Yeah.
She's wonderful to work with. I had a question in my head and it just evaporated because I was thinking about how much I love working with her. So you grew up in Atlanta.
Yes.
I'm also Southern.
Right.
I grew up in Houston.
Yeah.
But the world in and around Atlanta, it's, I think one of the things that's cool is that we see Atlanta from a kind of an outsider's eyes because Jade is just moving there for the first time. and so just kind of getting used to this new environment, the natural world around it, just like what it's like to be in this place. Yeah, what are some things that you love about Atlanta that you like? Oh, like this Atlanta thing, I really want to come across in the book.
Yeah.
Educator.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. I think we both agree, right? That there's like so many more stories from the South, you know, that have got to be told, or you know. Yeah, I mean, I think if I had to choose one thing about Atlanta that I would want for people to know, it's definitely just how diverse it is, you know, which is in some ways just like about how the South itself is so diverse, you know. And so sometimes, you know, I've spent most of my adult life in the North, and I find that, you know, sometimes people's preconceptions of Atlanta don't line up at all with what my experience was growing up. And it was interesting to write Atlanta, like you're saying, from the outsider's perspective, because I was, you know, stopping to think, like, what would someone notice, you know, first, coming here, or what would I want a reader to know about that they wouldn't necessarily know.
One of the things that's cool in the book is there are these scenes in a museum, and Jade's dad is working for a garden that's associated with the museum. Is fictional, or is it based on a real museum?
Both. The museum doesn't exist as I describe it, but it's definitely inspired by the internship that I had in D.C. At Dumbarton Oaks, as well as the Carlos Museum, which does exist.
Yeah.
And also other museums, because you know the South, I feel like, is sort of dotted with these kind of like old homes that have you know, like a historic value of some sort. So it's kind of like a mishmash of different places that all exist into one thing that I thought could be plausible with museums and gardens. And this is a place that, you know, her dad works at kind of these gardens outside with native plants, and the museum itself has, well, I don't want to give too much away. I'll stop. You gotta read it and see what the museum is.
You can get copies here if you don't have yours already, and you can get them signed. But yeah, it just reminded me so much of, like, I don't know, when I was a kid, like every Friday, my mom and I would go to the Museum of Natural Science, like in Houston, and what a magical place a museum can be for a kid, like, it's 12, 13, 14, just like uncovering, like, you know, you're starting to have more independence in school, learn things on your own, and a museum can be this kind of perfect place to kind of just like dive into history in that way. Was that the experience you had as a kid, and what was writing that scene like for you?
Oh yeah, good question. Okay, so when I was a kid, I did at least one summer do Camp Carlos, so like going to the Carlos Museum and art making at the museum, and yeah, thinking about it now, art making was like the way of interacting with the art objects, you know, yeah, and then there's also, you know, the High Museum in Atlanta, also, you know, art exhibits, and yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff that, you know, it's looking back on your childhood later on as an adult, you realize, oh yeah, there are all these things, and when you were a kid, it's like, oh yeah, you just go and see these things, and later you're like, wow, that was amazing. Yeah. Yeah.
Going in a bit of a different direction, just a quick plus, this book did receive a Kirkus star, so she is a Kirkus star author. One of the things that I thought was cool in the book is that I think the reviewer really got the kind of like big coming of age theme of the book, puts it in conversation with kind of these big books like Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, by Judy Blume, and I was wondering, like, if you had to put this, if this book was friends with like one or two other books, what books would it be friends with?
Oh man, that's tough. Okay, so I'll just say like the first thing that's coming to my head, because this is a tough question. In part because I feel like there's so many people doing such good work right now, but also the reason why they're doing good work is because these authors are writing their own particular story, right? And all of those particular stories are so good. And so, I mean, I recently finished reading High Spirits, which is about, you know, largely this neighborhood. and it's kind of like also a lot about family, and it's a magic realist, and also about kind of interwoven stories, So that's one that comes to my mind. Yeah, with this new collection. I mean, there's many others, that are also sort of like books that inform me in my childhood, because obviously when you're a kid, the things that you read really impact you, but I'm also trying to write something a little bit different from that too.
Yeah, totally makes sense. I think your book and my experience go excellently together. Personally, that is my beloved colleague Nick Thomas's book, The Epic That, so big fan. I have to ask at least one craft question, because I'm a huge craft nerd as a writer myself. What's your kind of like writing process look like? Are you a morning writer? Are you a nighttime writer? Are you a in-between classes, putting things in your iPhone notes writer?
Right. Oh yeah, good question. I'm not a morning person for anything. So not a morning writer, not a morning anything. But I guess like the basic question is, for me, it has to be kind of like broken up, right? So if I'm doing one thing one day, I can't possibly be doing two different types of things, right? Like, because I really need to immerse myself in the writing. Sometimes there's kind of rituals that might help that. So like green tea and chocolate after lunch, like when we settle in and nobody bother me, like that's a good little ritual. But it also just depends, what's going on in my life at the moment, what my space looks like. I want to take just one moment to shout out to Megan, my editor, who was amazing in this process. Really amazing. The book would not be what it is without her. I mean that. And so, I mean, to answer the question about the process, I have to talk about that too, the process of listening to Megan, trusting Megan, right? And then, being able to have kind of a conversation, and then still make it my own, but kind of be, my own story. And so that's maybe like, not on the day-to-day, but in like a larger scheme of things, from the time, that we met and started talking about the book to the time to now, we learned how to get into it, and really about that.
Yeah. So one thing about the book is set in 2001, kind of back to school era, August, September, which has been so interesting for me because I'm a late 90s child, so I was alive when the book was set.
Right.
But when I'm like, oh, middle schoolers now, like they weren't. I forget sometimes that middle schoolers these days were born in like 2010. I'm like, oh, how is that possible?
Yeah.
Like people being born in the year 2000 is still bizarre to me, and I'm born in 1998. But that's so funny to me because I talk to people like, it's an upper middle grade book. We're like talking about this book with like, contemporary 12, 13, 14-year-olds. And I'm like, should I be saying that this book is historical fiction? That doesn't feel right. Why did you decide to kind of set it in that time period, and what was that experience like of like kind of like interweaving these cultural moments, like the zeitgeist of 2001?
Yeah, that's also a really good question. I mean, even my college students, many of them were born in 2001 or 2002. Or
Yeah.
So, yeah, there you go. So, I definitely had in mind some sense of, that many of my readers would not have the events of 2001 as present in their mind as it is for those of us who, were a little bit older living through all of that. And definitely also there's, obviously the world is so different, but mostly because of phones and internet, right? Like, there's landlines in the book, and there's all this kind of logistics where your moms have to talk to each other to figure out when you're gonna like go over to the other person's house. There's all this kind of like old school stuff that was part of growing up that I really wanted to put in there, and I feel like now many of us millennials are just arriving at the age where we're kind of like, we've been thinking about a lot of these things, and the art that we've been making is kind of like finally coming to fruition, and we're wanting to be a little bit nostalgic about the early 2000s. So yeah, I mean, for me, like I was talking earlier about like making the green tea and the chocolate and whatever. Part of that is like going into the mindset of the world of the book, and the world is this particular world in which, it's a little bit magical, Greasy Sleeve, the Jaguar, but also like super, super real.
Yeah.
And so a lot of that was getting in touch with, what would this really have been like for Jade, informed by what was this really like for me when I was between 10 and 13.
Yeah. No, I think that's one of the things that's so special about this book is that it's like the parts that are like very contemporary coming of age. There's wonderful like friendship moments, trying out for the track team, like all of those kind of like hallmarks of being 14, and then you take us like on the like the trail becomes this portal into another world where she encounters Itzli and is able to grow in this other way. And you fuse those two. I mean, I guess it's kind of the essence of magical realism, right? Is like it's the world and it's not the world. It's but there's this kind of liminal space on the Wildcat Trail where Jade meets Itzli and all of this really cool storytelling happens. So I just think that's neat. That's not a question.
Thank you.
That's just me saying something. Make sure that you are thinking of your questions. We'll take a couple questions from the audience. So make sure that you are filing them away in your brain. I'll ask a couple more though, so you guys can have time to think of your questions. Because I know when I'm always doing these things, like, I have to think of a question now. But yeah, I guess similarly, because the natural world does play with both with her father, who is like a big plant guy. He's with the gardens at this museum. But then also, there's a really cool moment. I don't want to give spoilers, but with some trees in the forest that are cool. But yeah, what role did you like? What does the natural world mean to you, and why was that so important to kind of put into the book?
Yeah, I recently reconnected with a friend from elementary school, and I hadn't talked to her since 5th grade. And one of the things that we both remembered was playing in these specific woods. There is a school behind the house where I grew up in Atlanta, and so we were talking about how that informed our relationship to the natural world as something that feels like a place of magic and possibility somehow. Also, my mom's an amazing gardener, so definitely informs a lot of the way that the dad has a relationship to the natural world and this kind of thing. But also, I mean, some of this is like, you were asking earlier about something I want people to know about Atlanta. Atlanta is also very green and like has a lot of forest, and I think, especially living in New York for much of my adult life, I realized, okay, there's parks here, but it's not the same thing, right? Like there's actual kind of wooded areas that don't feel like exactly parks or suburbia. That it's really like kind of wilderness behind houses, and I definitely wanted that to come across in the story.
Yeah, no, definitely does. It's very cool. I'll ask one more question before I open it up to audience Q&A. What's next for you? Are you gonna do because I know you're also a scholar, so like how is your...
So stay tuned. There's more coming.
There's more coming. So, yeah, if anybody has any questions, feel free to raise a hand. And also ask more questions in the meantime. We've got plenty about this amazing book. Megan!
This is kind of a cheating question, but do you have a favorite thing about the book itself as an object?
Excellent.
Anything you want to show us?
Some show and tell.
Yes.
All the way around. And the super special thing is that once you read the book and then you go back and look at the cover, you're like, oh my god. So Molly Mendoza is the illustrator who made this. And I just love that it's like a totally different book underneath. Like this is like, you know, happy and fun and you know, there's something definitely deeper going on. And then this is like edgy. This is like, whoa, what's going on here? And there's that in the book for sure too. So
you know, I feel like it like perfectly encapsulates that like upper middle grade range that you're in also, where it's like it's happy. Also we're 14. We're old now. Edgy. High school boys.
yeah,
That's my favorite parts of the book. Yeah, no, it's such a stunning book. Also, when you were reading the excerpt that you read at the beginning about the rosettes on the Jaguar pelt, I was like, oh wow, like that's one, your description of the Jaguar hide pelt's fur is so beautiful, but then also it's just so beautifully rendered on the case as well.
And so creative, yeah, what she did.
Really stunning book. Yeah, go ahead.
You say you've been working on it since 2011. So how has the book changed over those years?
Yes, great question. I would say the story is still the same from the beginning, right? One of the main ways that it's changed, kind of a craft discussion here, is, you know, it's about kind of making it all one story and make it so that, you know, because there's stories within the stories, right? Because there's stories that Lee tells her. And, you know, now I would like to think, you know, that it's more clear to the reader, you know, how all of this is really about Jade's own story of, you know, self-discovery, finding out who she is in multiple senses, finding out who she is to her little sister, within her nuclear family, to her abuela, you know, and what is her relationship, you know, with the family, with the Spanish language, with the objects in her family as well, you know. I would say that, you know, that degree of kind of like texture and massaging, it's just, I think it's just better now. But the story is the same from the very beginning. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was wondering how you picked the name for the show. Or, I mean, if you think maybe it's stuff in full.
It's hard to answer that without spoilers. You're talking about the name of the protagonist?
Yeah, I guess I was just thinking,
Yeah.
I don't know, I think of also identity and how people, or like identification by others is so often indexed through the name, sort of how you were thinking about that.
Yes, and it's I mean, one of the things that happens, there's a character who largely speaks to her in Spanish, not entirely, but largely. And I do address the fact that, you know, sometimes she's Jade, you know, and sometimes she's Jade, and sometimes she's another name, which I'm not going to give away. And they're all the same thing, right? They're all Jade, and ultimately they all kind of mean the same thing, but it is like, you know, it is like having multiple names that you answer to, which I think is common for many of us who are in multilingual contexts and families. Or just in general, you know, people have nicknames that they answer to that have nothing to do with their names sometimes too. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, that's a great question. My abuelita called my mom. My mom's name is Cheryl. My mom is not Mexican, so it's Jade. CH even though.
Right.
Question? I can ask more questions. I have plenty of questions. What's this fantastic book? A question I have for you is, when did you know that you wanted to study history? Like either an undergrad or as a profession?
Yeah, that's a huge question. Okay, I will say this. It became clear to me in college when I studied history and literature together, that studying just one or the other without the other wasn't going to make sense to me, and that what was more interesting to me than what happened was the stories people told about what happened, and the narratives about history. So that's a lot of what my PhD experience has been about.
It's very cool, and definitely very evident in your book as well. I feel like so much of this book is about like, the power of storytelling. You mentioned earlier about like the figure of Abuela and like, oral kind of culture, but also the stories that are handed down to Jade by her grandparents as well.
Yes, and then also, the stories that are written / painted,
Yeah.
that we still have. I think one of the main differences between undergrad and grad school approaching history is just getting more into the primary sources, and thinking about, how were things told during the moment that I'm talking about, and how were things talked about centuries later. Not necessarily that one is more valid than the other, they just can tell us different things, and that's part of what I wanted to convey. Thank you for that question.
I don't have a question, but it's more of a comment. And I have 2 kids, and growing up in New York City in the 2000s, I remember like having a really hard time finding literature for my kids to read about the immigrant experience, about bilingual stories. I remember going into bookstores and asking them for books, and it's like, what do you want? We have Dora the Explorer. Like, no, I don't want Dora the Explorer. I want real literature. I want like stories written for children. And it's like, oh, what do you mean? Like, give me a list and I will bring it. So I really want to thank you for filling up this space for Hispanic parents who are growing up or raising kids in New York City, and finding a voice in your literature, speaking about the immigrant experience and being bilingual and all of these wonderful things that you touch in the book.
Thank you very much. That's amazing to hear that. Yeah.
Just to follow up, I know Alex talked about the role art played in your childhood, but I wondered if you talk more about how you got into fiction writing as a child and how that shaped it.
Yes. Well, I had like a kindergarten teacher, first grade, second grade. I had the same teacher for 3 years, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, which maybe was a great thing, actually, the continuity of it. We went to elementary school together. And she told me, Miss Sanders, she said, if you can read, you can write, which isn't necessarily, it's something to be told that, right? And then I also remember, another moment with you, specifically with my mom, like realizing in a bookstore, like, oh, like grown-ups also read and write made-up stories. Like, because I think I had internalized some idea of that it was somehow childish, I don't know, and then realizing, oh no, this is a real thing that you can do. And then lots of people that look at all these books, and so, and we had writing workshop all through my elementary school, which is this amazing program. And in fourth and fifth grade, I had Miss Campbell, who was another really influential teacher who taught me some of the like really special basics about, there's a beginning, middle, and end to a story. Like really kind of really basic things that you don't necessarily know when you're 10 years old.
Yeah.
And I started writing stories every Christmas for my cousins. And so I would make these books and give it to them, and it was like a series that starred them. And they went on all these adventures. So I did that, up through like my teenage years. That's some of it. And when I was going to bed at night, before I could even really write or had the concept of writing stories, but I had the concept of making up stories in my head as I fell asleep, my dad would tell me these stories starring recurring characters that would be like these bedtime stories. So all of that kind of contributed, I would say, to like stories and fiction writing, and eventually, my parents sort of suggested, well, you make up all these stories, you could write them down, and then you realize, oh, it's a lot harder to write it than to just think about it, but it's really fun. Thank you for the question, Molly.
Does anybody have any more questions before I ask my last question? My last question is, this is your debut novel, very exciting.
Yes.
I'm sure there'll be many more wonderful things to come. But this is, publishing a debut novel is a very special thing. What's been your favorite part of, what are the most exciting or most unexpectedly fun part of, having a book?
Yeah. It was really amazing to see it physically the first time. I mean, especially because it's so physically interesting as a book, but it's different. Like I had seen the PDFs, PDFs of the illustrations, and I had kind of tried to see, okay, how big is it going to be, but I didn't know exactly what is the thickness, what is the paper going to feel like. I hadn't seen these textured in papers, another feature. So, in fact, my roommate at the time brought up the first copy of the book, and I was trembling, and I FaceTimed my parents because I wanted them to experience it with me too. But it's not the same until then. Finally, they saw a physical version they got. So I think that was the most surprising thing for me, because it's oh wow, it's really real. It's super real.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it really is. It's both a beautiful text to read and a beautiful object. So everyone should go out and buy a copy. And buy copies for your friends. But thank you so much, Alex, for sharing your pub day with us. Let's give Alex a round of applause, everybody.